I want to bring up a headline for you. World Health Organization and the Gaza polio vaccination campaign are on day one. They're probably on day two now. That was yesterday's news or the day before. But what's shocking about this, and that image in itself, is you can see that they are giving the oral polio vaccine, as they call it. So what's so shocking about that? Well, we went to what I regard as the very best in an expert on polio, and that is Dr. Suzanne Humphries. So welcome to the show, Dr. Suzanne Humphries.
Hello, Polly. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show at such late notice. So lots of people talking about this right now because we all know the dangers of the polio, thanks to your book, Dissolving Illusions. But can you tell us why this is so dangerous? Because it's the oral polio, correct?
It is. Okay, so the reason they give the oral polio vaccine is because they say it doesn't need the type of refrigeration that injection needs. It doesn't need professionals to administer it. It's easy to administer. You can give mass amounts of it at one time. But what you should know about this one is that it is a novel oral polio vaccine. It's a genetically modified oral polio vaccine that was developed and first listed by the World Health Organization in the year 2020. It is unlike any oral polio vaccine that's been given before because they have basically genetically modified it so that it hopefully, and not definitely, but hopefully will not do what the other oral polio vaccines do, which is once you put them in somebody's gut, they can mutate. And the longer they're in there replicating, the more likely it is that they can mutate and become something more virulent and spread to somebody else, which is exactly what happened here because this boy, 10-month-old boy who has a partially paralyzed limb and has been deemed to have poliomyelitis, has been diagnosed with a circulating vaccine, oral polio vaccine derived virus infection. That's what they're saying. And so that's the biggest news is that the boy that started this media campaign, I should say, was infected by a virus from a vaccine, not from a wild polio virus. So it's unique in a lot of ways, not to mention the fact that there are hundreds of cases of this type 2 viral sourced polio infecting people worldwide, all over the world, including London, the USA, type 2, just like this boy has, London, USA, Egypt, Congo, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Malawi, Mozambique. Go to the World Health Organization website and you can see it for yourself. Yet, interestingly, we're going to stop a war that had absolutely no regard for children whatsoever. Israel is all of a sudden humanitarian and is going to stop a war because what the UN and the World Health Organization asked them to, so they can go in and save all these children that have been potentially infected by a vaccine-derived polio virus by giving them a new genetically modified oral polio vaccine that has never been fully tested, that is released on emergency use. And most of the testing early on was done on people who were already fully vaccinated so that their chances of having a mutation are less because of that. I mean, it's so crazy and so corrupt and so weird that I'm kind of laughing and crying at the same time, quite frankly.
All right, let's summarize this up. So what you're saying is there was a boy who had already had the vaccine, polio vaccine. And
no, he has, of course, no, he's unvaccinated. He's a 10-month-old because, there was this war. But before the war, Gaza was 99% vaccinated. And they say you need they make the numbers up as they go. Okay, so you need higher than 95% vaccinated in the population in order to prevent this from happening. And they dropped down to 90% as of January this year. And so, boom, now we have polio infections going on because this poor boy couldn't have got his polio vaccines because of the war-torn devastation. So that's kind of the bottom line. And on every article you read, it says polio can't be treated, but it can be prevented. And it says verbatim, it can be prevented if given multiple times, can protect a child for life. What? I mean, they protect themselves by saying can protect a child for life is very unlikely to protect anybody for life. And given multiple times as the excuse why they're going to pause the war twice, not just once. So we're going to stop, then we're going to start killing again, and then we're going to stop again to vaccinate the children. Now, the other point I want to make is that this boy, who is partially paralyzed in one leg, is now the poster child for starting a vaccine campaign. Now, what happened when the polio vaccines came on the market is that they changed the diagnostic criteria. Before the polio vaccines in the 1950s, you could diagnose someone with polio if they had paralysis in one set of muscles and 2 exams 24 hours apart. But after the vaccine was released, you had to maintain your paralysis for 60 days in order to be considered polio. And what some of the arguments against the vaccine and the trials and the data and the propaganda is that more than 90% of people will recover the use of their limb within 60 days. So more than likely, this child's going to recover the use of his limb within 60 days. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that how many bombs, I shouldn't say we, I had nothing to do with this, the bombs and the devastation that were dropped on these buildings, melting plastic, melting electricity, melting chemicals, not to mention what was in the bombs. The amount of toxicity people in that region have had to endure is astronomical. And we know that poliomyelitis, which is the actual disease that involves the spinal cord and the paralysis of limbs, can be induced just with toxins. There doesn't even have to be a virus involved. But if there is a virus involved, that virus becomes more invasive, potentially more invasive in the presence of certain chemicals, like we know DDT, we know arsenic, we know lead. So what else are they dropping over there? What is in the chemicals that were in those bombs? If they dropped bombs on any factories that were making pesticides, I mean, that's enough to cause paralysis in lots of people around that area right there. So it's just kind of weird that given that there have been hundreds of cases all over the world, all over these areas, that all of a sudden this one case sparks a media campaign that's going to pause a war. If I were the people over there, I would be very suspicious of the men in blue that were coming over to bring these vaccines, and what other kind of activity might go on during the ceasefire. And who's going to follow these kids? Who's going to follow up it'll be 10 days max follow up to look for adverse events. Who's going to follow them up? Who's going to find the problems in these kids if anything happens? Who's going to be able to delineate it and do proper testing to see that it's not a mutated vaccine virus or that it had anything to do? If people get really sick, nobody's going to follow it up and nobody's going to do the work to distinguish it as a vaccine problem.
Right. Well, now, what do we know about this novel oral polio vaccine thing? What do we know? What could be potentially the side effects? What could happen? And what is that weird thing they're scratching on their finger? What's that about?
Well, because I only had a day to research this after you called me, I haven't been able to really dissect the actual manufacture of this oral polio vaccine, aside from knowing that it is absolutely genetically modified, where they went in and they flip-flop switching genes around to hopefully make it so that it won't mutate as much. So the problem with the vaccines is that you put them into somebody and they are attenuated, meaning they're less virulent, meaning they're killed at a lower temperature. They're easier to kill, the vaccine viruses. But once you put them back in their natural host, they mutate back to virulence. And so that's the problem. And that's why people are able to be infected, and why the most common infection of polio virus in this world today comes from vaccines, not from the wild type. But the wild type is still available in Afghanistan and Pakistan for wild infections. So it's not eradicated. So what's unique about it is that it's genetically modified vaccine. And, it's the same old playbook where it's the same old story where we hear we've almost eradicated a disease like measles, we heard this, or like polio. And then, why happened? Oh, it's a war, or, oh, it's, COVID. And then they weren't able to vaccinate enough people. And then there's all these vaccine hesitant people. But don't worry, because we've now developed a new vaccine. So they essentially have changed the goalposts here, where they're now treating it with a new minimally tested vaccine that, on a leap of faith, because it's pretty much similar to the old ones, and that it's an oral polio vaccine, that it's going to be safe to give to everybody. I don't know what other chemicals are in this vaccine. But all I know is that the genes in it have been manipulated to hopefully make it less mutagenic once it's put into a host. But what's also interesting is that in 2016, I don't think I'd met you then, but I remember researching and doing a video on Israel because Israel had decided to add the oral polio vaccine to the schedule for children in addition to the injectable polio vaccines. So they're giving both. But what they did that year is they left out the type 2 virus. They only gave the 1 and 3. And back then I said, nature doesn't like a vacuum. This isn't going to go well. And even Paul Offit today is calling this the release of the dragon, because what they've essentially done is because they only treated type 1 and 3, type 2 has had a chance to come back. It's like the whack-a-mole vaccine game that I talk about. You just can't keep pressing them down and thinking that another one's not going to pop up differently or another mutated. It's the same old thing with the meningitis vaccines. It's the same old story repeated over and over again. So I just think that people in that region should be somewhat suspicious of what's going on here. People in that region should get some of that vaccine and test it themselves if they can, send it somewhere, find out, really what's in it, and that it's consistent from lot to lot, because we know from the COVID vaccine campaigns that the lots can vary from box to box, what's actually in them.
And I presume it's emergency use authorization. It's not an approved shot.
That's right.
Okay, so just so people are absolutely clear, emergency use authorization means they have not done the testing. They do not know what's going to happen, just like with all the COVID nonsense that we went through. It's hard to watch out for. Why are they scratching on their finger? What's that about?
Oh, yes. So in order to identify who has been vaccinated, I believe it's a pinky finger. I didn't know it was a scratch, but they definitely do something to the pinky fingernail, because I've been seeing pictures of little kids kind of looking down at their own fingers. And so that's how, when they go around basically into people's homes and trying to identify who hasn't been vaccinated, that they'll know who was and who wasn't. Now, the question is, what do they do on the second round? I guess they'll use a different finger for the second round so that you can be basically marked as vaccinated.
Well, I think we should send a load of those pens out and drop them down on those parents so they can actually mark out their child themselves, because there's nothing more dangerous, in my opinion, than what they're doing right now to those poor children.
It's all very suspicious. It's extremely odd and suspicious.
Now, Dr. Suzanne, you've given a very generous gift, you and Roman, for talk to us about that, which is the chapter of your book. And it's a revised book. Talk about your book for a second, the fact that you've done it up.
Yes. So early on, before we did the 10th anniversary edition, which we just put out this year, we did release the polio chapter by itself. And now we're re-releasing the new polio chapter, because I think it's important, because near the end, there is some research by Dr. Jacob Polio out of India, where they've been doing the same thing in India for ages, this pulse vaccination campaigns. And he showed how the more vaccines that are given, the more paralysis occurs in children. And when they pegged back the vaccination programs, the paralysis in children pegged back. It's a very important chapter in terms of looking at what else causes poliomyelitis, what kind of drugs, what kinds of infections, what it really is, and the history of it, the history of the testing of the vaccines, the corruption, which actually freaked me out when I first started researching it. So we're releasing that chapter for free through CHD, and also it shows you where you can purchase the book if you choose to. But that chapter is now available in full for people to read and pass around to other people.
Thank you. And we're going to put that in our show notes. Where can people buy the book? Because there's people around the world that will be watching this.
Yeah, the best place to go is dissolvingillusions.com, because it'll show you the two places where you can purchase it, a private printing shop, and you can now have it shipped overseas if you would like. There's the anniversary edition, which has the color photos of like you and Kent and me and John and everyone touring on the bus. And so there's lots of interesting stuff in there. Or you can just go to Amazon worldwide, all the different Amazons, you can buy it. But if you don't like Amazon, you can go to a place called GHP Printing. But that's all on the website at dissolvingillusions.com.
And the most famous, just lastly, the most famous question they yell at us at the bus and everywhere we go is, what about polio? What about polio? Well, I can say, having just come back on the last bus tour, I have never seen so many crippled, forget autism now, we're way beyond that, so crippled 3-year-old boys that can't hold their heads up, children in wheelchairs, children that have polio.
Polio never went away. Transverse myelitis is essentially polio, and the ventilators that we use today essentially took the place of the iron lungs. And again, it's just shifting the goalposts, shifting the visuals that we have. Now we're shifting the vaccine into a new GMO vaccine. It's just how it's always been done. So it's just more reason why people just need to do their own research and decide for themselves what's right for them and their families, and not just blindly listen to the talking heads on the television. And especially, I used to think the World Health Organization was like this an organization with integrity, with the smartest people on the planet. Oh my gosh, just such corruption in the UN, history of corruption in the UN that I've gone through in some of my videos, where they, reuse syringes, have been responsible for spreading AIDS. What goes on in these camps. This is another point to make, is these camps. Why can't UNICEF and the UN get together and what they'd be better off doing in these camps where people are catching these diseases because there's no sewage? Give them shovels. You just give all these men that are in this camp some shovels. They can dig some latrines, they can dig some wells, and they could probably do better for themselves than what they are. But the problem is, and this is another thing, you can go on the United Nations Relief Works Agency page, and it says verbatim, already displaced families are on the move again, namely due to insecurity and Israeli evacuation orders. So Israel, and I'm not political. So whatever's going on in the Middle East, it's all terrible. Nobody should be killing anybody, and the fighting should stop. But I just want to say that Israel, who is relocating all these people, and the UN, who is supposedly making these camps, and they're completely unsafe in so many different ways, rapes, murders, diseases, etc. And all of a sudden they care enough to stop their war so they can vaccinate children. It's crazy as it can get.
Yeah. It is. Thank you, Dr. Suzanne, so much for coming on last minute and updating us on the polio. Everyone, please go and get Dissolving Illusions. Enough of us have told you to do it. It's very important. And Suzanne, thank you for all the work you do for us and continue to do for us.